Welcome to Bistory Media. On January 4 and 5, 1967, delegates and representatives from both the federal government of Nigeria and the eastern region, led by Lieutenant Colonel Emeka Ojukwu, met in Aburi, Ghana, to agree on what is now known as the Aburi Accord. The meeting at Aburi was supposed to be the last opportunity to avoid any conflict or civil war. Unfortunately, it was not to be. After the first military coup that installed Major General Johnson Thomas Agui-Ironsi as Nigeria's first military head of state, on January 16, 1966, the northern soldiers had started planning, by May 1966, the revenge of their leaders who had been murdered in January. The northerners were the major casualties of that coup that was carried out by soldiers mainly from the east. To them, it was an eastern-favored coup as Agui-Ironsi's regime was believed to be extremely partisan. This highlighted the feeling of insecurity of other groups. It created more problems than it solved old ones, which led to severe criticism of the supreme commander. The general himself may not have been necessarily nepotistic. Rather, he failed to see the sectional and clannish implications of events, policies, and appointments that were made during his tenure of office. 194 days after taking office, Agui-Ironsi was murdered in a northern counter-coup on July 29, 1966, and for 3 days, the nation had no recognized leader until Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon succeeded the late head of state on August 1, 1966. The immediate significance of the July coup was that it forced a return to an ethnic balance within the army, as neither the major ethnic groups, Hausa or Yoruba, was placed in power, but a minor ethnic group from the northern region in present-day Plateau State. In the confusion that followed the second coup d'etat, the slender confidence that remained between the Igbo and the northerners was shattered. Disturbances broke out in the east, but even more so in the north after August 1, 1966. The mass killings of the Igbo in the north were a deplorable act that was condemned by Nigerians, including the military governors. With the counter-coup of July 29, 1966, the political development of Nigeria's federal structure took a different turn. It was accentuated even more by the fact that the Eastern Regional Government in Enugu immediately threatened secession if certain grievances and demands were not met. The immediate concern of the federal government, therefore, was for it to find ways to appease the East, so long as such concessions were within the framework of one Nigeria. Claiming he was not safe outside the East, the Eastern Military Governor, Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, refused to leave the region for any meeting anywhere in Nigeria. In a rejoinder, the federal government too argued that the Nigerian leader, Yakubu Gowon, should also not go to the East for a meeting. His life, they also claimed, was not safe there either. Tension mounted, and Lieutenant General Joseph Arthur Ankara of Ghana offered a neutral meeting place. The venue was Aburi, Ghana. The Aburi meeting started on January 4, 1967 and lasted for 2 days. Aburi was significant for several reasons. First, that the leaders met at all was an achievement in itself. But even more tangible was the fact that the leaders agreed that force would not be used to settle the brothers' palaver. There was also the question of the disposition of Nigerian troops and the reorganization of the army after the second coup on July 29, 1966, and the subsequent killing that followed in May and September. Further, Ojukwu said that his region was perturbed, that contrary to Gowon's promise on August 9, 1966, that all soldiers would return to their region of origin, northern troops still occupied the western region. Gowon replied that his promise of August 9 applied to the repatriation of soldiers of northern origin stationed in the east back to the north, and those of eastern origin stationed in the north back to the east. He had fulfilled his promise, he said. He then emphasized that soldiers of northern origin would remain in the west since there were only a few Yoruba in the Nigerian army. Ojukwu was not satisfied and further insisted on a reorganization of the army on a regional basis. Gowon was also firmly opposed to splitting up the army. Ojukwu claimed that Nigeria did not have a central government since the country, as a result of the second coup and its aftermath, resolved itself into three separate sovereign areas: the Lagos West-North area, the Midwest area, and the East area. But Gowon insisted that Nigeria was still one nation, an entity composed of 4 regions and a central government in Lagos. Ojukwu then proposed that the situation in the nation necessitated a drawing apart of the regions because the separation of forces, the separation of the population is, in all sincerity, necessary in order to avoid further friction and further killings. The other leaders, who all wanted one Nigeria, agreed to Ojukwu's proposal, but apparently without understanding the implication. This was the bombshell of Aburi. By agreeing to Ojukwu's argument that the region should first pull apart in order to stay together, the other leaders in effect sanctioned Biafra's secession, hence the end of Nigeria as a single nation. They attended and left the Aburi meeting with the firm belief that Nigeria should and would continue as one nation. But they had gone to that meeting, as it seems, without adequate preparations in terms of a crew of legal and political advisors which such a meeting demanded. They had gone to Aburi in a spirit of comradeship. Ojukwu, on the other hand, meant business. He arrived in Aburi with a strong team of legal, political, and economic advisors, secretaries, and realms of paper. Not only did the other leaders agree with Ojukwu that the regions and people of the nation should first draw apart, but they also agreed to the latter suggestion that there should be no more supreme commander of the army, hence no head of government or head of state. What Ojukwu wanted was that whoever was at the top should be a titular head, who would only act when all of them have met and taken a unanimous decision. Since the unanimous decision of all the regions was required before he could act on all matters which affected any of the regions or the nations as a whole, the commander-in-chief and head of the government was only so in name. He would still be a titular head. The point of the agreement at Aburi was that each region would be responsible for its own affairs and that the federal military government would be responsible for matters that affected the entire country. A simple enough concept. Afterwards, the officers toasted their reconciliation and agreement with champagne. The federal delegation's jubilation was such that on his plane flight home, Ojukwu asked one of his secretaries whether the federal delegation had fully understood the implications of what had been agreed. However, no one at Aburi other than Ojukwu really understood the constitutional implications of what had been agreed. Ojukwu was obviously delighted with this, hence why he was in such a hurry to implement the decisions that were taken, and why Gowon had to break his promise. Federal permanent secretaries who headed the various ministries of the government as of then, as well as political and legal experts in the country, were appalled at the content of the Aburi Agreement when their leaders returned home. The permanent secretaries met on January 20, 1967 to evaluate the agreement, and they rightly argued that the title of Commander-in-Chief was a subtle way of either abolishing the post of the Supreme Commander or declaring it vacant, now that its previous occupant, Major General Agui Ironsi, was dead. They further reported that the proposal that all appointments to top posts in the military, civil service, and the diplomatic corps be unanimously approved by the Supreme Military Council would tend to paralyze the functions of the Federal Public Service Commission. They also noted that the allegiance and loyalty of the regionally appointed officers of the federal government would be to regions, meaning in effect that there would be no federal public service. The summary of their report was that the Aburi Agreement summed up to a confederation. The leaders themselves were shocked. Then, from February 16 through February 18, 1967, Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon summoned a meeting of the secretaries to the military government and other officials which was held in Benin City over a memo one of the permanent secretaries had written concerning the Aburi Accord. The memo traced the long, hard road that Nigeria had traveled and stressed the need to keep a united nation. The permanent secretary who wrote this memo was Prince Solomon Akenzuwa, who later, as Erediawa I, became the 39th Oba of Benin on March 23, 1979. However, Prince Akenzuwa was an outstanding civil servant. In fact, he rose to become the Federal Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Health, before he retired in 1973. Akenzuwa in the memo said that Gowon had given too much away in Aburi and that it would lead to the destruction of the country. He also said that Gowon had legalized total regionalism, which would make the center very weak. Prince Akenzuwa further alluded in his memo that a weak center would lead to a confederation and a total disintegration of Nigeria. The shocking revelation of the meeting of the Aburi Agreement overshadowed some of the important decisions the leaders agreed to at Aburi in their search for peace and for a new basis of a stable federal union, or at least, a national unity. Aburi on the whole was a big success, but the interpretation of what transpired at the meeting devalued the success. Ironically, implementing the decisions agreed on at Aburi was necessary. Ojukwu then set March 31, 1967 as a deadline for the unilateral implementation of the Aburi Accord. Gowon, on the other hand, broke his promise and restated that the constitutional changes the East proposed would not work because such changes would result in the end of Nigeria as a single nation. As Prince Akenzuwa had written in his memo, Gowon had given too much away in Aburi that would have led to the destruction of the country. He legalized total regionalism, which would make the center very weak, and a weak center would eventually lead to a confederation and total disintegration of Nigeria.